August 14, 2025. Cabazon, California. A frantic mother calls 911. Her baby boy, 7-month-old Emmanuel Haro, has just been snatched from her car in a brazen, broad daylight abduction. Police launch helicopters. Volunteers flood the streets. The whole town searches for a missing infant, and the clock is ticking. But within days, the story begins to crack. Surveillance footage doesn't add up. Neighbors whisper about strange noises from the Haro home before the so-called kidnapping. And then, prosecutors drop the bombshell. Emmanuel wasn't taken at all. Investigators now believe the baby was already dead before the mother ever dialed 911. What follows is a nightmare. Arrests, dark family secrets, and chilling letters from jail hinting they'll never find him. The baby's body? Still missing to this day. And the parents? Accused of the unthinkable. So what really happened to Emmanuel Haro? And why does this case still haunt California to its core? Before we dive deeper to uncover how boy Emmanuel vanished like thin air, hit subscribe for more unsolved and chilling mysteries. They called him Emmanuel, a small, ordinary name for an extraordinary absence. He was 7 months old, a sliver of a life that barely reached the weight of a single breath in the world's attention before the world began to ask, with the fierce and terrible curiosity that grief and outrage bring, where he had gone. The first story the public heard was simple and cinematic. A mother, her infant stolen in the glare of a parking lot afternoon, a desperate search. A community pulling at its edges to find a child. But what followed was not a neat mystery with a neat ending. It was a slow, bitter unspooling that left harder questions and answers about a family, about the small legal decisions that can cascade into catastrophe, and about the way a town and a nation watches when the most vulnerable among us vanish. On the evening of August 14th, a call came in that set off the machinery of alarms. Rebecca Haro reported that she had been attacked in a shopping center parking lot on the outskirts of Cabazon, California, and that her infant son, Emmanuel, had been taken. People do not forget the image of a mother on the news, pleading for help for a child. Within hours, strangers had posted photos. Neighbors drove out into the desert dusk, and reporters crowded the courthouse and the sheriff's office. The photograph authorities released. The tiny face in a onesie, eyes like question marks, became the anchor of thousands of shares and prayers. For a moment the story fit the template of every nightmare parents know. A random cruelty, a frantic search, a community acting in concert against an anonymous evil. Volunteers with flashlights combed scrublands near freeways. Deputies dispatched cadaver dogs along stretches of dry brush. Helicopters scoured the pale elevation of Moreno Valley. The father, Jake Haro, was seen walking with deputies through a parched field off Gilman Springs Road, an image that for many became an unbearable contrast. A man who would, in time, be both the center of a community's grief and the focus of the public's suspicion. But the neat narrative began to fray almost immediately. Detectives reviewing surveillance footage and court documents began to find inconsistencies. The timeline that had been presented, a single, violent abduction in the bright blur of afternoon, did not reconcile with the evidence. Interviews and records suggested that Emmanuel's last confirmed sighting had been days earlier than the reported abduction. Prosecutors and sheriff's investigators quietly told reporters that new evidence pointed to a far darker possibility. The child had been abused over time and had likely died before the public alert. What had begun as a missing child case reoriented into a homicide investigation. When arrests came for both Rebecca and Jake Haro, the community reacted as though a scab had been rudely peeled back. The charges were severe: murder and filing a false police report. Authorities said they believed the parents had staged the abduction narrative after Emmanuel had already died. The couple's public statements, pleas, and protestations of innocence collided with prosecutors' assertions that the death had not been an isolated incident, but the culmination of ongoing harm. For many, the shock was not only that a child had been hurt, but that warning signs had existed before, and nothing had stopped them. The most painful, impossible angle in this story was not just that a young life had ended, but that history had whispered warnings. public records and reporting showed that Jake Haro had a prior conviction related to child cruelty. In some versions of the record, that earlier case had resulted in a sentence that many now called ineffectual, probation and work release, where others felt prison was warranted. When neighborhoods learn of a prior pattern of abuse and then hear of a new tragedy, rage focuses on the institutions, judges, prosecutors, the probation system that allowed someone to remain a parent in the community. The rage is not hypothetical. It is that of people who imagine themselves or their children in the same small bed, in the hands of someone who had been judged dangerous before. Yet this anger and the legal actions around it did not produce Emmanuel's body. Months into the case, while arraignments and press conferences unfolded behind courthouse windows, the baby's remains had not been recovered. Deputies, cadaver dogs, and volunteers continued to walk desert washes and neglected lots, but each search ended the same way, with more questions, with locations marked on maps that were emptied of answers. The absence of a body complicated both prosecution and closure for those who loved Emmanuel, and for a community that demanded a final truth. How do you grieve and prosecute when the physical proof of a death has not turned up in the places you searched? That is the question that hovered over every press briefing and parish prayer. There is a particular kind of horror that belongs to cases where the missing are presumed dead but not found. It is a limbo that forbids the final rights and forces families into endless speculation and legal limbo. It turns the courtroom into a stage where prosecutors must build a case of death without remains, relying on forensic timing, hospital records, other children's testimonies, and patterns of behavior. In public, that made the investigation both messier and more dramatic. Television and social media poured over every letter of the court filings. Contributors and online sleuths cross-reference home addresses with satellite images and past arrests. Some of the sleuthing was helpful, turning up an old arrest report, a neighbor's public comment. But some of it was destructive, generating conspiracy theory fever that confused witnesses and, at times, threatened to derail sober legal work. Even as legal authorities pursued their evidence, the story took on the tone of a morality play. Prosecutors held press conferences that were heavy with implication, pointing to surveillance review, to an altered timeline, to statements that contradicted the initial abduction claim. The district attorney's office spoke of a child who had likely suffered for days, of a family narrative that collapsed under the weight of documents and video. Yet even prosecutors, speaking in the measured cadence of public officials, were careful. They presented allegations, not every vow to find justice came with the legal hedges we expect in a functioning system. Indictments, arraignments, potential trials. But the public's thirst for narrative closure is never so patient. The Haro case did not unfold in a vacuum. It landed in a regional landscape already raw from previous cases of child abuse and judicial leniency. Columnists and citizens demanded to know who knew what and when, and whether social services or the courts had failed Emmanuel by allowing a pattern to continue. There were careful investigations into the earlier conviction and whether probation officers monitored Jake Haro appropriately. There were also heavier, less disciplined responses. Online calls for vigilante recovery of remains, unverified leads that shifted the direction of neighborhood searches, and the kind of rumor that can hurt families already in grief. The public conversation felt like a mirror held up to institutions. This is how we failed our children, many argued. This is how a system's small tolerances can become deadly. And then there was the human core of the story, the parents. In the weeks after the arrests, public appearances by Jake and Rebecca Haro were charged with defiance, sorrow, and the odd human reflex to narrate oneself as victim. Jake, who gave interviews from jail and was photographed assisting in at least some searches before his arrest, insisted in public statements that he had never wanted harm to come to Emmanuel. Rebecca, in interviews and filings, maintained she had been attacked and that she loved her child. These are familiar motifs. The assertion of parental love counterposed with allegations of monstrousness. The court filings and press conferences are where emotion meets evidence. And in that liminal space, people watch for the leak between performance and truth. Reporters followed every twist and turn, and their coverage often became the vessel through which the community's sorrow and anger traveled. Local news anchors delivered details about search locations and court dates, with the same cadence used for hurricanes and fires. National outlets picked up the story because it fit into a grim catalog. The story of a baby taken, the alleged fabrication of an abduction, and the revelation of prior abuse. Readers and viewers responded with the two human reactions that tend to define media age: empathy and the appetite for blame. Many readers demanded outrage. Some demanded the restoration of prior safety nets. In comment sections, strangers debated how this could have happened and whether prior penalties for child cruelty were too lenient. Amidst the media churn, one reality remained stubbornly true. Emmanuel had existed. His remembered smallness, the way he fit in photographs, the pattern of his onesies, was a counterweight to the abstractions of court documents and legal strategy. Families in the area lit candles. Strangers left tiny toys near roadside shrines. Parents posted warnings and memory prayers. When the body had not been found, people still needed something to hold, and they held on to his photograph and the memory of a face that had not learned to frown. That human need complicates the work of investigators, because it invites the public into spaces where evidence is scarce and emotion is plentiful. For the investigators, the case demanded a delicate balance between public information and investigative confidentiality. They had to pursue leads, re-examine medical and child care records, re-interview neighbors, run forensic timing analyses, without tipping off defense counsel any more than procedure required. They needed to test the areas where the father was seen walking with deputies and to follow up on the remote spots called out by cadaver dog alerts, while understanding that the absence of a body would require a case built from inference, timelines, behavior, prior convictions, and the occasional physical fragment. Prosecutors told the press that they believed the abuse had been ongoing and that the alleged abduction had been an attempt to conceal that reality. But proof beyond a reasonable doubt is hard to get when death has no physical echo, and the legal fight ahead promised to be exacting and long. There are also small, painful human details that rarely make the first headlines, but that any parent can instantly understand. The unmade future of a child whose birthday candles will never be blown out. The quiet, quotidian rituals that define infant care. Late-night feedings, checklists of vaccinations and doctor appointments that suddenly become relics of a life ended. In the Haro household, neighbors later remembered quiet porch lights and a baby monitor left on in the early morning. Some spoke of the sounds of a toddler long ago and of a couple who sometimes appeared harried. These small observations do not make a case, but they give texture to a tragedy, making it feel less like a news item and more like the slice of private life that was violently interrupted. If the case of Emmanuel Haro forces a larger reckoning, it is this: when institutions fail, when prior convictions do not result in the structural protections a child needs, tragedy can become foreseeable. Public officials use the story to promise reviews and reforms. Journalists asked whether social service interventions had been adequate and whether prosecutors had the tools they needed to prevent further harm. Meanwhile, online communities tried to help in their own chaotic ways, uploading maps and collecting tips. Some of that crowdsourced energy led to new leads and new scrutiny. Some of it produced harassment and misinformation. The modern missing child case, in the age of social media, becomes both more visible and more unruly. What remains at the story's core is an absence that television cannot fill and courtrooms cannot entirely explain. Arrests and indictments satisfy a public hunger for answers, but they do not always return a child to the arms that wanted him. The Haro case stands as an example of how quickly public narrative can harden around a family, first as victims, then as suspects, and how easily a community's sense of tragedy can be translated into moral certainty. The law proceeds through evidence. The moral world wants to move faster. In the space between lives and small bodies slip away, there is, finally, the courtroom to come. If prosecutors proceed without the crutch of a body, their case will hinge on the mosaic assembled from evidence. Surveillance timestamps, medical notes, prior convictions, discrepancies in statements, and the patterns that, together, create a picture that jurors might see as murder. Defense counsel will insist on alternative explanations, on ambiguities, on the obligations the state bears to prove each element clearly. Trials built on inference, death by circumstances rather than the testimony of a coroner, are rare, but not impossible. The legal struggle will be exacting. The public, conditioned by endless true crime narratives, will watch and weigh every deposition and camera shot. Through it all, the most humane thing any observer can do is hold to a small, difficult truth. At the heart of every case like Emmanuel's is a child who cannot speak. The rest is for us, the institutions, the journalists, the strangers who lend a voice in comment sections, to handle with a measure of restraint, a respect for evidence, and a refusal to let outrage flatten human complexity into caricature. That restraint is sometimes asking too much of a public hurt and angry. But it is the only way to let the legal process do its work, imperfect though it often is. And so the desert continues to yield its secret slowly, if at all. Search teams return to brush and thistle, and to the stretches of road that wind through the inland empire. Lawyers prepare briefs and subpoenas. Neighbors move on, carrying an image of a child in their phones and in their memory. And the national conversation pivots from one tragedy to the next, while the Haro case remains, for now, a live wound. It is a story about loss, yes, but it is also a story about questions. How many warnings must a system ignore before it is deemed complicit? What is the threshold where private behavior becomes public emergency? How can communities better protect their smallest members before it's too late? There will be hearings and filings and probably, at some point, a trial. There will be families asking whether anything could have been done differently and officials promising inquiries and reform. There will be, too, people who insist on a definitive picture of blame because certainty is easier to live with than ambiguity. But Emmanuel will remain what he always was, a child whose life was brief, whose absence has left a vast emptiness, and whose memory asks of the public, in the bluntest possible terms, that we be better than we have been. If justice in its full sense is possible, it will require not only conviction and punishment where the law proves it should be applied, but also the sober work of prevention, better monitoring of parental offenders, clearer lines between probation and child protection services, more aggressive intervention when prior abuse exists. These necessary fixes are not headlines. They are the slow, unflashy work that could, in time, prevent another little body from being lost in the scrub. For now, the country watches Emmanuel's case the way a family watches a puzzle come apart, one piece at a time, holding on to the picture that once made sense, longing for the day when the edges finally meet. The photographs of Emmanuel remain, circulated in news stories and shared in prayer posts, a small face against a pastel blanket, eyes not yet understanding of the world's cruelty. Those images carry the story forward in the only honest way possible, as a call. For authorities, it is a call to meticulous, relentless work. For citizens, a call to vigilance, and to demanding systems that protect children before small missteps become tragedies. And for all of us, a call to hold the memory of the smallest among us with a tenderness that the public spectacle can otherwise make impossible. Emmanuel's story will be cataloged in the city's memory, in court dockets, in the archives of local journalism, and in the private lives of people who feel the chill of this kind of loss. Whether it becomes a case that reforms systems, or one that simply becomes another episode in the endless churn of headlines, will depend on what those institutions, and we, choose to do next. In the end, the unsolved parts of the Haro case, the parts that cling to the notion of a missing child presumed dead but not found, are the aspects that keep the story alive in the public imagination. They refuse the finality of tidy endings. They force us to look at how we treat the warnings a community gives us and to ask whether the legal and social structures designed to protect our children are sufficient. They demand that when the next small life is imperiled, we do not wait for an image on a news feed to move us to action. We must look earlier, intervene deeper, and keep together, because Emmanuel's silence will not be answered by rhetoric alone. It will be answered by changes that make a real difference in the lives of children who are still here. The final stretch of the Emmanuel Haro case felt like a slow walk toward a locked door. Months had passed since the arrests. Rebecca Haro, 23, sat in a jail cell, her public defender filing motions that insisted she was a victim of circumstance, that she had been manipulated, that the timeline prosecutors used was full of holes. Jake Haro, 26, occupied a separate cell block, his lawyers promising to reveal the real story at trial. Yet the community, neighbors, searchers, strangers who had followed every press conference, wanted only one thing: the truth about what happened to the child whose face still appeared on flyers now frayed from rain. The problem was, no one could agree on what the truth was anymore. Detectives still believed Emmanuel had died days before the supposed abduction. They pointed to medical records showing evidence of injuries. They noted witness statements placing the baby inside the Haro home on days when the parents claimed he was missing. They had phone data, surveillance timestamps, gaps in the couple's stories, and the bruised history of Jake Haro's prior conviction for child cruelty. But what they did not have was a body. The desert searches continued, one after another, each promising resolution. Sheriff's deputies and volunteers combed canyons with rakes, turned over rocks, sent drones buzzing over the pale hills of Moreno Valley. Cadaver dogs alerted in 2 areas, but nothing surfaced. It was as if the land itself refused to give Emmanuel back. And with every failed search, the case grew colder and darker. The Haros defense team seized on the missing body like a weapon. "You can't prove a death without a victim," one lawyer told the press. "You can't prove murder when you can't even tell a jury where the child is." But prosecutors pushed forward, their voices flat, their evidence grim. They spoke of abuse, of the unimaginable suffering of a child too young to crawl away, too small to even cry loudly enough for neighbors to hear. They laid out the timeline with a precision that cut through the courtroom. The last confirmed sighting of Emmanuel alive on August 9th. The 911 call about the supposed abduction on August 14th. The searches that found nothing but silence. Every hearing was a spectacle. Reporters crowded the benches. Families of both parents sat stiff and pale as prosecutors read out medical charts and showed photographs no one wanted to see. But the most chilling moment came when a neighbor testified about hearing, late one night, the sound of something, a thud, a cry, then silence, coming from the Haro home days before the abduction story broke. She said she hadn't called police because, in her words, "I didn't want to believe what it sounded like." Her voice cracked on the stand. The courtroom went so quiet it felt like the air had left the room. Still, even with all this, there was no body. And without a body, the jury would have to convict on the shape of absence, on fragments of evidence, on a story told in bruises and phone records rather than the undeniable fact of a child's remains. As the case crawled toward trial, rumors swirled. Some claimed the parents had buried Emmanuel deep in the desert. Others said the body had been destroyed in ways too terrible to name. Social media lit up with amateur detectives mapping every route out of Cabazon, every drainage ditch, every abandoned shack in a 20-mile radius. None of it led anywhere. And then came the jail letters. Rebecca wrote to a cousin, letters that prosecutors later entered into evidence. In them, she said things like, "It all happened so fast, and I didn't want this." She never directly confessed. Her lawyers insisted the words were being twisted, but the tone was heavy with regret and fear. One line, scrawled in shaky handwriting, stuck with detectives. "They'll never find him." It was the closest anyone had come to an admission. And it was the moment the case stopped feeling like a mystery and started feeling like a horror story. By the time the preliminary hearings ended, the picture was brutal. Prosecutors alleged that Emmanuel had suffered at home, that his death had been hidden, that the abduction call was a lie to buy time. The defense said there was no proof of any of it. But through it all, the question remained. Where was Emmanuel? The final search took place in late autumn. Deputies returned to a stretch of desert off Gilman Springs Road, the same area where Jake Haro had once walked alongside search teams, pointing, directing, insisting he wanted his son found. This time, the wind tore at their jackets, and the sun fell hard across the dust. They found nothing. Again. The sheriff's spokesperson gave the same weary statement they had given for months. The investigation remains active. We are committed to bringing Emmanuel home. But everyone knew the truth. Emmanuel was gone. The trial, when it came, would be long. It would be full of experts talking about timelines, about bruises on photographs, about cell phone pings and witness statements. Jurors would argue late into the night. Reporters would write headlines about justice, about tragedy, about systems that fail children before anyone even knows they're in danger. But none of it would bring Emmanuel back. The last image the public had of him was still the same photograph released in those frantic first hours. A tiny boy with round cheeks, eyes wide, wearing a onesie patterned with blue stars. A child who should have been learning to crawl, to laugh, to reach for his mother's hands. Instead, he became a face on a poster, a name in a courtroom, a story people told in hushed voices about how something like this could happen, right here in their own town. And somewhere out there, in the scrub, the hills, the endless dust of the California desert, the answer to the only question that mattered stayed buried in silence. Because Emmanuel Haro had vanished, and the land wasn't giving him back. Not now. Maybe not ever. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell, so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike a chord. Thanks for watching.